to think for a moment about your favorite food. What is it? We all have different food preferences, but food is a source of large molecules that are needed for life, called biomolecules, also known as macromolecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. In different types of food, you might find higher amounts of these biomolecules. For example, peanut butter can be high in both proteins and lipids. And while we'll mention examples of foods that contain different biomolecules in this video, this is not a video on nutrition. This is a video on the classes of biomolecules and their importance to the structure and function of cells, and therefore also to the entire organism, because organisms consist of these cells. Before we get into details about the 4 biomolecules, we need to talk about one very important vocabulary word, the word monomer. A monomer is a building block. If I had some large substance, the parts that make up that substance are called monomers. With each biomolecule class, we will mention its monomer if it applies. We'll start with the biomolecule class of carbohydrates. Generally, food sources such as bread, pasta, fruit, and vegetables tend to be high in carbohydrates. The monomer of a carbohydrate, remember that means the building block, is the monosaccharide. One example of a monosaccharide is the sugar glucose. Glucose is a pretty big deal considering it's used in cellular respiration to make ATP, an energy currency. If 2 monosaccharides, such as glucose, are combined, you get a disaccharide. For example, put these 2 glucose sugars together and you get the disaccharide maltose. By the way, a lot of sugars have that OSE ending. Glucose, maltose, lactose, sucrose, fructose, I could go on. The ending OSE can be a carbohydrate clue. If you join a lot of monosaccharides together, that can combine to make a polysaccharide, a big carbohydrate. So how are carbohydrates important to an organism and the structure and function of its cells? Well, plants have cell walls of carbohydrates, specifically a large one known as cellulose. Fungi have cell walls of carbohydrates too, specifically one known as chitin. Fun fact that carbohydrate chitin is also what makes up the exoskeleton of insects. We mentioned glucose is used to make ATP. That makes carbohydrates a fast source of energy for cells. So that's a big function for carbs, a major energy source that cells can access. That energy can be stored in a polysaccharide form. Remember, polysaccharide is a big carbohydrate, such as starch for plants or glycogen for animals. Next up, lipids. Lipids include fats and oils. Examples of food sources could include butter or olive oil. This is a seriously diverse group, meaning there are a lot of types of lipids. There are triglycerides, there are phospholipids, there are steroids. These are just some examples. Most, but not all, lipids have building blocks of glycerol and fatty acids. One thing, though, that lipids generally share? Generally, they're hydrophobic, or at least contain a significant hydrophobic component. That means lipids, or at least a major component of them, don't like water. Lipids generally won't dissolve in water. And that's interesting, as generally the other biomolecules will. So how are lipids important to an organism in the structure and function of its cells? Remember how we said all cells, plant cells, animal cells, all cells, have membranes? Well, thank you, phospholipids, for that phospholipid bilayer, because that's right, lipids make up cell membrane structure. Lipids have a major function of being a source of long-term energy storage. You remember how we said carbohydrates were a fast source of energy, but when those carbs are used up, lipids have a function as long-term energy storage that an organism can use. Lipids are also very important for different types of insulation. The insulation may involve helping a cell carry an electrical impulse. For example, this myelin sheath made of lipids that can be found on many neurons. Or the insulation may involve temperature regulation, so thermal insulation. For example, the blubber on this adult harp seal is made of lipids, helping it conserve heat. Another cool function about lipids, many lipids act as hormones, which are chemical messengers for many different processes. Next up, proteins. Protein food sources include beans, meat, nuts, and eggs. The monomer of a protein is an amino acid. Usually, proteins consist of many amino acids bonded together. There are different types of amino acids. So how are proteins important to an organism in the structure and function of its cells? Structure-wise, tissue like muscle tissue consists heavily of proteins. Proteins can make up all kinds of other structures, hair or collagen, for example. Proteins can also be found embedded in cell membranes as protein channels. And channels are important to that cell membrane structure, with functions of letting certain substances pass through. Proteins can also be receptors, which are critical in cell signaling, so cells can coordinate actions together. Most enzymes are made of proteins. Remember, enzymes can build up or break down substances in all kinds of metabolic processes. Antibodies, which are made by immune cells in your body, are proteins, and they're involved in protecting your body. And some critical hormones, such as insulin, are proteins. And when we start talking about genes, genes are made of DNA, but many genes do code for proteins. And that brings us to our last one that includes DNA, nucleic acids. Nucleic acids include DNA and RNA, which we'll get to in more depth when we get to genetics. Nucleic acids have a monomer called a nucleotide. That's going to be an easy one for you to remember because nucleotide sounds like nucleic acid. By the way, you might wonder, are nucleic acids like DNA and RNA found in my food? And the answer would be yes! Whenever you eat something that came from something living, it actually could still have DNA inside it. For example, when you eat a strawberry, you're actually crunching all the cells that made up that strawberry, and in the nucleus of all those strawberry cells is DNA. Any type of life, like plants or animals or fungi or bacteria, they must contain nucleic acids like DNA to direct the cell's activities. How are nucleic acids important for your cells? Well, most of your cells contain all of your genetic information in the form of nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, and this is needed for the coding of your traits involved in structure and various functions. Okay, so we just did a very general tour of 4 biomolecules. Before we go, I just have to marvel at biomolecule structure because it's absolutely beautiful. So if I arrange them in the order we did, carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, how might we remember the major and most common elements in them? There's a popular mnemonic known as CHO, CHO, CHON, CHOMP, although it's CHOMP with an N, to help me remember the C for carbon, H for hydrogen, O for oxygen, N for nitrogen, and P for phosphorus. Does that mean you won't find other elements in the biomolecules? Of course not. But it's important to understand the arrangement of these elements in biomolecules because the structure of the arrangement greatly impacts their function.